You're settling in now. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day's finally quiet, and here on Tales of Vatican Secrets, we're about to step past a threshold most people never even notice exists. If you haven't subscribed yet, maybe now's the time, because what we're walking into tonight isn't atmosphere or legend. It's structure, it's systems, it's the actual mechanics of how silence gets built into stone and ink. I'm curious, which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Midnight? Later? That strange hour when everything sharpens? Because tonight we're not chasing shadows. We're looking at real documents, real decisions, the physical architecture of restriction itself. And once you understand how one rule, one operational principle buried inside the Vatican's archival system supersedes every other regulation, every other promise of access, you won't see those archives the same way again. There's no going back from this. So, let's begin. You're standing at the edge of something most people believe is about history, about scholarship, about the careful preservation of memory. But what you're actually looking at is a system designed first and foremost around control and only secondarily around access. The Vatican Secret Archives, renamed in 2019 to the Vatican Apostolic Archives in a gesture meant to soften centuries of suspicion, occupy a complex of buildings and underground chambers stretching beneath and alongside the Vatican Palace. And the single most important thing to understand about them isn't what they contain, it's how they decide what you're allowed to see. And more importantly, the one principle that allows them to reverse the decision at any moment without explanation. This isn't speculation. This is encoded in the access protocols themselves, in the researcher application forms stored in the Sala di Studio, the main reading room where scholars sit beneath vaulted ceilings and work under a silence so thick it feels like a physical substance. That room, renovated in the 1980s to accommodate more researchers as the Vatican slowly opened more material to public view, is where you first encounter the visible edge of the system, the request slips, the catalog references, the polite formal procedures that make it all seem orderly, academic, neutral. But underneath that surface, written into the institutional DNA of the archives themselves, is a rule that has never been formally published, never been included in the researcher's handbook distributed at the entrance, and yet governs every single interaction between a scholar and a document. The principle that the prefect of the archives, acting on behalf of the Holy See, retains absolute and unreviewable discretion to deny access to any material at any time for any reason or for no reason at all. This isn't a safety valve. This isn't an emergency measure. This is the foundational logic of the entire system, and it's been operative since the formal reorganization of the archives under Pope Leo III in 1881, when he issued the rules that first allowed limited scholarly access while simultaneously ensuring that the Church's control over its own historical record remained total and unchallengeable. Leo XIII's decision is often celebrated as an opening, a moment of transparency, but reading the actual administrative documents from that period, archived themselves in the Fondo Particolare series under the classification AP, Archivio Particolare, reveals something more complex. A system of access built on revocability, where permission is always temporary, always conditional, and always subject to withdrawal without appeal. The physical structure of the archives reinforces this. When you enter the Cortile della Pigna entrance used by researchers, you pass through multiple checkpoints, each requiring separate identification and approval. And the deepest sections of the archives, particularly the material stored in the bunker-like chambers constructed in the 1980s beneath the Belvedere courtyard, are accessible only through a system of elevator access controlled by archive staff who maintain a rotating schedule of vault openings. You cannot simply request a document and have it delivered. Each request is evaluated not just for clarity or proper cataloging reference, but for alignment with what the archive considers appropriate research, a category that has never been precisely defined and that shifts depending on the prefect's interpretation, the political climate within the Vatican, and the nature of the material being requested. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents censorship or simply institutional prudence, but the effect is the same. A researcher can spend months gaining access, establishing credibility, working through preliminary materials, and then suddenly find that a specific fondo, a specific series, even a specific document within an already approved series, is simply unavailable, with no explanation beyond a polite note indicating that the material is not currently accessible for consultation. The phrase appears on refusal notices generated by the archive's administrative office, and its vagueness is deliberate. It doesn't say the document is missing or damaged or restricted by a specific rule. It simply places the material outside the boundary of what can be seen, and the researcher has no mechanism for appeal, no committee to petition, no formal process for challenging the decision. This is the reality that separates the Vatican archives from almost every other major archival institution in the world, where restrictions are typically codified, time-limited, and subject to review. Here, restriction is the default state, and access is the exception, an exception granted or revoked entirely at the discretion of a single office. The consequences of this are profound and often invisible. When a historian publishes a book on papal diplomacy during World War II, for instance, and that book is based on documents from the Fondo Pio d'Orvie's, the papers of Pope Pius XV, open to researchers only in 2020 after decades of pressure, the reader has no way of knowing which documents the historian requested but was denied, which lines of inquiry were closed off before they could develop, which questions remain unanswered not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the evidence was placed out of reach. This creates a kind of archival shadow, a zone of absence that shapes historical understanding without ever being acknowledged, and it means that every major work on Vatican history is, in some sense, a negotiation between what the archives permitted and what the historian was able to construct from those permissions. The rule that allows this isn't written on the walls. It isn't explained in orientation sessions, but it's understood by every serious researcher who works in those rooms, felt in the carefully neutral responses from archive staff when a request is denied, and embedded in the institutional culture of an organization that sees itself not primarily as a repository serving scholars, but as the guardian of the Church's institutional memory, answerable first to the Holy See, and only secondarily to the demands of historical inquiry. And the deeper you look into how this works, into the physical systems, the administrative procedures, the quiet mechanisms of control, the clearer it becomes that this rule isn't an unfortunate side effect of Vatican secrecy. It's the entire point, the central organizing principle that makes everything else possible, and the reason why understanding the Vatican archives requires understanding not just what they contain, but the architecture of restriction that determines what you're allowed to know. You're beginning to see the shape of it now, but let's go deeper into how this principle actually operates in practice, because the genius of the system isn't that it denies everything, it's that it grants enough access to create the appearance of openness while maintaining absolute control over the boundaries of inquiry. And nowhere is this more visible than in the catalog system itself, the vast indexing structure that determines how materials are classified, referenced, and ultimately made available or kept hidden. The Vatican archives use a cataloging method that evolved over centuries, with different sections following different organizational logics depending on when they were incorporated into the central archive. Some fondos are arranged chronologically, others by papal reign, others by the administrative office that generated the documents, and still others by subject matter as determined by archivists working decades or even centuries after the documents were created. This means that finding a specific document requires navigating not just one catalog, but multiple overlapping systems, each with its own internal logic, its own gaps, its own peculiarities. The main published catalogs available in the Sala di Studio provide broad outlines. They'll tell you, for instance, that the Archivio Consistoriale contains records of papal consistories, or that the Fondo Borghese holds correspondence from the Borghese family's papal administration in the early 17th century. but they rarely provide document-level detail, which means that researchers must often request entire boxes or series based on educated guesses about what they might contain. And here's where the discretionary rule comes into play with particular force. Even when a document is listed in a published catalog, even when its existence is openly acknowledged, a request for access can still be denied. And the denial won't necessarily reference any formal restriction or closure date. Instead, it will simply invoke the prefect's authority to determine what constitutes appropriate consultation. This happened repeatedly during the long campaign to open the Pio Dauphine archives. Historians had been requesting access to those materials since the 1960s, particularly after Rolf Hochhuth's controversial play Der Stellvertreter raised questions about Pius XIV's response to the Holocaust. But the Vatican maintained that the documents were still being catalogued, still being organized, still not ready for scholarly consultation. A position they held for nearly 60 years, even as researchers point out that other papal archives from earlier periods, with far larger and more complex document sets, had been opened decades earlier. The cataloging explanation was technically true, work was ongoing, but it also functioned as an indefinite deferral mechanism, a way of saying not yet without ever having to specify when yet would arrive. And when the archives finally opened in 2020, researchers discovered something both revealing and frustrating. Many of the documents were indeed cataloged, organized, and perfectly accessible, which meant the delay had never been primarily about logistics. It had been about control, about waiting until the institutional moment felt right, until the generation of church officials most directly connected to Pius XIV's papacy had passed, until the political sensitivities had shifted enough to make disclosure seem manageable. The decision to open the archives wasn't driven by the completion of cataloging work. It was a discretionary choice made by the prefect and approved by Pope Francis, and it could just as easily have been delayed another decade, or 2, or 3, with no violation of any formal rule, because the formal rule is that there are no binding timelines, no enforceable standards, no external authority with the power to compel disclosure. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a sustainable model for a modern archival institution, but the Vatican's position has been consistent. These are the Church's documents, created by and for the Church, and while the Church chooses to allow scholarly access as a courtesy and as a contribution to historical understanding, that access remains a privilege, not a right, and privileges can be modified or revoked as circumstances require. This philosophy is embedded in the physical layout of the restricted sections. In the Archivio Segreto section, which despite the name change still contains materials classified as sensitive or reserved, documents are stored in sealed armadi, locked cabinets, within locked rooms, within controlled access corridors, and the keys to those armadi are held not by the archive staff who manage day-to-day researcher interactions, but by senior officials within the Secretariat of State, the Vatican's central administrative and diplomatic office. This means that even the archive's own employees cannot access certain materials without specific authorization from outside the archive itself, creating a dual-layer control system where institutional oversight supersedes professional archival judgment. A practical example. In the 1990s, when historians began intensively researching Vatican diplomacy during the Cold War, particularly the Church's role in Eastern Europe and its relationship with various communist governments, they found that documents from the 1960s and 1970s, materials that would typically be considered mature enough for historical research, remained almost entirely inaccessible, not because of a formal closure date, but because they touched on diplomatic relationships that were still considered operationally sensitive. The Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with many of the governments discussed in those documents, and the Secretariat of State determined that opening the materials could complicate ongoing negotiations, undermine trust, or reveal intelligence sharing arrangements that needed to remain confidential. Whether you agree with that reasoning or not, the key point is that the decision wasn't made by archivists applying professional standards for document disclosure. It was made by diplomats and administrators applying political and institutional criteria, and the archive's role was simply to enforce those decisions. This creates a fundamental tension at the heart of the Vatican archives. They function simultaneously as a historical repository and as an active institutional memory for a sovereign state that still conducts diplomacy, still negotiates treaties, still maintains relationships that can be strengthened or damaged by the release of historical information. And when those two functions conflict, when historical transparency threatens diplomatic discretion, the rule that overrides all others becomes operational. Institutional control trumps scholarly access every time, without exception, without appeal. The consequences of this ripple through the entire field of Vatican studies. When researchers write about papal policy in the 20th century, they're not just working with the materials that happen to survive. They're working with the materials that have been deliberately selected for disclosure. And that selection process is shaped by the same institutional interests the historian is trying to understand. This creates a kind of circular problem. You're using the Vatican's records to understand the Vatican's decisions, but the Vatican has determined which records you get to see based on how those records might affect contemporary understanding of those same decisions. It's not quite censorship, because the documents aren't destroyed, but it's not quite transparency either, because access is filtered through a discretionary system that prioritizes institutional protection over historical completeness. And the deeper you go into the catalog system, the more you realize that this isn't a bug. It's the fundamental design principle, the load-bearing wall that holds the entire structure in place. And removing it would require reimagining not just the archives, but the Vatican's entire relationship to its own history. You're deep enough now to see how the system works at the procedural level, but there's another layer underneath that, one that deals with what happens when the discretionary rule intersects with specific categories of material that the Vatican has determined require permanent, indefinite protection. And this is where we encounter the real architecture of silence. The classification structures that place certain documents not just behind locked doors, but behind conceptual barriers that make them functionally invisible to researchers who don't already know they exist. The most significant of these structures is the Archivio Particolare, a designation that translates roughly as particular or special archive, but in practice means something closer to reserved for internal use only. Documents classified under the AP designation aren't included in the main catalogs available to researchers. They don't appear in the published indices. They're not referenced in the finding aids that guide scholars through the collections. They exist in a parallel archival universe, known to Vatican officials and senior archivists, but effectively hidden from external view. This isn't a small collection. Estimates based on oblique references in internal Vatican publications suggest the Archivio Particolare contains tens of thousands of documents, possibly more, covering everything from sensitive diplomatic correspondence to internal investigations of clerical misconduct, from financial records the Vatican considers proprietary to theological disputes that never reached the level of formal controversy, but that the Church preferred to keep internal. The classification isn't based on age. Some AP materials date from the 16th century, others from the late 20th, and it isn't based on a single subject category. Instead, it's based on a determination made at various points by various officials that the material in question serves the Church's institutional interests better by remaining inaccessible than by being open to scholarly review. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this constitutes a legitimate archival practice or a form of institutional memory suppression, but the Vatican's position has been that every sovereign state maintains classified records, that diplomatic correspondence routinely remains sealed for extended periods, and that the Church's unique role as both a spiritual authority and a temporal power requires discretion that goes beyond what might be expected of purely secular institutions. The physical reality of the AP system is striking. These documents aren't stored in the main archive complex accessible to researchers. They're held in separate facilities, some within Vatican City itself, others reportedly in secure locations outside the Vatican's walls, in buildings owned by the Church but not publicly identified as archive sites. Access to these facilities is restricted even among Vatican employees. Archivists who work in the Sala di Studio managing researcher requests have never seen the AP collections, don't know their full extent, and couldn't access them even if they wanted to. The chain of custody runs through the Secretariat of State and, for certain categories of material, through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the office formerly known as the Holy Office, and before that as the Roman Inquisition, which maintains its own archive of documents related to doctrinal investigations, heresy trials, and theological controversies spanning 5 centuries. That archive, known formally as the Archivio della Congregazione per la Dottrina della Fede, operates under even stricter protocols than the main Vatican archives. Researchers cannot request access. The materials are not cataloged in any public format, and disclosure happens only when the congregation itself decides to publish specific documents, usually heavily edited and contextualized as part of an official historical study or rehabilitation effort. A concrete example of how this works: in 1998, the Vatican published a selection of documents from the Holy Office archive related to the trial of Galileo, part of an effort to address the historical controversy and demonstrate that the Church's treatment of Galileo was more nuanced than popular accounts suggested. The published documents were valuable and revealing, but they also represented a tiny fraction of the Holy Office's records from that period, and researchers had no way to know what had been excluded, whether the selection presented a complete picture, or whether other documents in the archive might complicate or contradict the narrative the Vatican was constructing. The publication was presented as an act of transparency, and in some ways it was, but it was also an exercise in controlled disclosure. The Church revealing what it chose to reveal in the manner it chose to reveal it, while maintaining absolute discretion over everything else. This pattern repeats throughout the history of Vatican archival access. When materials are opened, they're often opened selectively, with certain categories or time periods made available while others remain closed, and the criteria for those decisions are rarely explained in detail. The opening of the Pio XIII archives in 2020 is a case study in this. The Vatican announced that the pontificate of Pius X, covering 1939 to 1958, would be made accessible to researchers, and this was widely reported as a major breakthrough. But the announcement came with qualifications that weren't always emphasized in media coverage. First, accessible didn't mean immediately available. It meant that the archives would begin a phased opening process, with certain fondos available right away and others released gradually as staffing and logistics permitted. Second, the opening applied to the official papal archives but didn't automatically include related materials held by other Vatican offices. The Secretariat of State's diplomatic files from the same period, for instance, remained under separate administration and separate access rules. Third, and most significantly, the prefect retained full discretionary authority to restrict access to specific documents or series within the opened collection if consultation of those materials was deemed potentially harmful to living persons, to diplomatic relationships, or to the Church's institutional interests. This last provision is the discretionary rule in its purest form. Access is granted in principle but remains revocable in practice, and the standards for revocation are determined entirely by the institution being studied. The consequences of this have been visible in the research produced since 2020. Historians working in the Pio XIII archives have found extraordinary materials, detailed records of papal diplomacy during World War II, correspondence with bishops across Europe, internal debates about how to respond to Nazi persecution, but they've also encountered frequent redactions, unexplained gaps in document series, and occasional denials of access to materials that catalog references indicated should be available. Some of these restrictions make sense under conventional archival standards. Documents containing personal information about living individuals, for instance, are routinely restricted in archives worldwide. But others seem driven by institutional sensitivity rather than privacy concerns. And researchers have no way to challenge those decisions or even to confirm what's being withheld. This creates what archival theorists call an evidentiary shadow, a zone of absence that shapes historical interpretation without being visible in the historical record itself. When you read a book about Pius XV and the Holocaust, you're reading what the author was able to construct from available evidence, but you have no way of knowing what evidence was unavailable, what questions couldn't be answered, what narratives couldn't be tested, because the documents necessary to test them were kept out of reach. And because the Vatican's discretionary rule operates without public justification, without formal criteria, and without external review, that evidentiary shadow can never be fully mapped or accounted for. It simply remains a permanent feature of the historical landscape, shaping what can be known and what must remain uncertain. You're at the point now where the abstract system starts to show its teeth, where the discretionary rule stops being a theoretical principle and becomes a force that shapes real historical questions, real scholarly careers, and real gaps in human understanding. And this is where we need to talk about what happens when researchers push against the boundaries, when they try to navigate around the restrictions, when they attempt to use catalog ambiguities and procedural gaps to access materials that the Vatican would prefer to keep closed. Because the rule that overrides all others doesn't just operate through formal denials, it operates through a more subtle mechanism of discouragement, delay, and strategic ambiguity that makes certain lines of research so difficult, so time-consuming, and so uncertain that many historians simply abandon them in favor of more accessible topics. This isn't conspiracy, it's bureaucratic friction deployed as a form of soft censorship, and it's extraordinarily effective. The process typically works like this. A researcher identifies a promising line of inquiry, something that requires access to a specific fondo or series within the Vatican archives. They submit a formal research application, which must include a detailed description of their project, their scholarly credentials, letters of support from their institution, and often a letter of recommendation from a Catholic bishop or a recognized Vatican scholar vouching for their seriousness and discretion. This application goes to the prefect's office, where it's reviewed not just for scholarly merit, but for institutional sensitivity. Does the project touch on controversial topics? Does it involve examination of documents that might reflect poorly on specific popes or Vatican decisions? Does it require access to materials that intersect with ongoing diplomatic relationships or unresolved theological debates? If the project seems likely to produce scholarship that the Vatican considers problematic, the application isn't necessarily rejected outright. Instead, it enters a state of prolonged review, where the researcher receives periodic communications indicating that their request is being considered, but that certain clarifications are needed, certain additional materials must be provided, certain preliminary questions must be answered. These requests for clarification can continue for months, sometimes years, and they serve a dual purpose. They give the Vatican time to assess the researcher's intentions and scholarly approach, and they test the researcher's persistence, effectively sorting out casual inquiries from serious, committed projects. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this constitutes a reasonable vetting process or a deliberate obstacle course designed to wear down researchers before they even enter the archives. But the effect is indisputable. Many projects never make it past the application stage, not because they're formally rejected, but because the researchers eventually give up, redirect their work to more accessible materials, or choose different topics entirely. For those who do gain access, the next layer of control emerges in the document request process itself. Let's say you're researching Vatican diplomacy with fascist Italy in the 1930s, and you've identified a specific series within the Archivio della Nunciatura Apostolica in Italia, the archive of the papal nunciature in Italy, that should contain relevant correspondence. You submit request slips for specific boxes within that series, and the archive staff retrieves them from storage. But when the boxes arrive at your desk in the Sala di Studio, you discover that certain folders within the boxes are missing, or the documents referenced in the folder labels aren't present, or that pages within documents have been removed, leaving only fragments of correspondence that no longer make narrative sense. When you inquire about these gaps, you're told that the materials are under review, or that they've been temporarily relocated for conservation work, or simply that they're not available at this time. You have no way to verify these explanations, no mechanism for confirming whether the documents actually exist in the condition claimed, and no appeal process if you believe the restriction is unjustified. This is the discretionary rule in its most frustrating form. Access granted and simultaneously denied. Permission given but hedged with enough qualifications and limitations that the research becomes fragmentary, incomplete, and ultimately difficult to bring to any definitive conclusions. The consequences of this are visible throughout the historiography of 20th century Vatican diplomacy. Almost every major work on papal policy during the World Wars, during the Cold War, during decolonization, and the transformation of the global Catholic Church contains passages where the historian must acknowledge that certain questions remain unanswered because the relevant documents were inaccessible, or that certain interpretations remain speculative because the evidence needed to test them was unavailable. This isn't the ordinary incompleteness that characterizes all historical research. Historians always work with partial evidence, always confront gaps in the record, but rather a systematic pattern of restriction that correlates directly with institutional sensitivity, where the materials most likely to be restricted are precisely those most likely to challenge official church narratives or complicate the Vatican's contemporary diplomatic and moral positioning. A specific example, researchers studying the Vatican's knowledge of and response to the Holocaust have identified numerous gaps in the available record, particularly around the question of what information reached Pope Pius XI about Nazi extermination camps when it reached him, and what internal debates occurred within the Vatican about whether and how to respond publicly. Documents exist. We know they exist because they're referenced in other documents, in diary entries by Vatican officials, in correspondence that survived elsewhere. But many of these specific records remain inaccessible under the discretionary rule, officially because they're still being cataloged, or because they contain sensitive diplomatic information, but functionally because they touch on one of the most controversial questions in modern church history, and their disclosure could strengthen criticisms that the Vatican considers unfair or historically reductive. Some historians quietly disagree about whether Pius XII's response to the Holocaust was adequate, but everyone agrees that a full assessment requires access to the complete documentary record, and that record remains incomplete not because documents were lost or destroyed, though some certainly were, but because institutional discretion has placed them beyond scholarly reach. The Vatican's counter-argument is that it has opened unprecedented amounts of material, that the Pio XII archives represent one of the largest and most significant archival releases in church history, and that the restrictions that remain are limited, reasonable, and consistent with standard archival practices worldwide. There's truth in this. The Vatican has indeed made enormous quantities of material available, and researchers working in the Pio XII archives since 2020 have produced important scholarship that has genuinely advanced historical understanding. But the counter-argument also deflects from the central issue. In almost every other major archival system, restrictions are codified, time-limited, and subject to external review or legal challenge, whereas in the Vatican system, restrictions are discretionary, indefinite, and answerable only to the institution creating them. This isn't a minor technical difference. It's a fundamental distinction in archival philosophy, and it means that Vatican history will always be written under conditions that prioritize institutional control over complete documentation. The rule that overrides all others isn't a safety mechanism or an emergency provision. It's the core operating principle, the permanent structure that determines how history gets told, and the reason why every book about the Vatican, every scholarly article, every documentary, every argument about what the Church knew when it knew it and what it chose to do with that knowledge is ultimately a negotiation between what the archives permitted and what the historian could construct from those permissions. And until that changes, until the discretionary rule is replaced with codified, reviewable, time-limited restrictions, The Vatican secret archives, regardless of what they're called, will remain fundamentally different from every other major historical repository, not because of what they contain, but because of the principle that governs access to what they contain. You're standing now at the deepest level of the system, where the discretionary rule intersects with the physical reality of how documents are stored, cataloged, and in some cases effectively disappeared, not through destruction, but through classification systems so complex and so deliberately opaque that materials can exist within the archives while remaining functionally inaccessible to anyone who doesn't already know exactly what they're looking for and where to find it. This is the shadow catalog, the informal organizational layer that sits beneath the official indices and finding aids, and understanding how it works requires understanding a specific historical moment. The reorganization of the Vatican archives in the 1920s under Monsignor Angelo Mercati, who served as prefect from 1919 to 1936 and oversaw a massive consolidation and reclassification effort that brought together materials from dozens of different curial offices, papal administrations, and ecclesiastical collections into a unified archival system. Mercati's work was genuinely important. He created the basic organizational structure that still governs the archives today, established professional cataloging standards, and opened significant new sections to scholarly consultation. But he also established something else: a classification methodology that allowed documents to be cataloged in multiple overlapping systems simultaneously, creating a situation where a single document might be referenced in one index under its date of creation, in another under the papal administration that produced it, in another under the curial office responsible for it, and in yet another under its subject matter. And these various catalog entries wouldn't necessarily cross-reference each other or indicate that they were describing the same document. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate choice, designed to give the Vatican maximum flexibility in how it presented its holdings to researchers. Because a document that existed in multiple catalog systems could be made visible or invisible depending on which catalog a researcher was directed to consult. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents sophisticated archival management or an intentional obfuscation tactic, but the practical effect is clear. Researchers working with different entry points into the catalog can reach dramatically different conclusions about what materials exist, what's available, and what remains restricted. The physical manifestation of this is visible in the storage system itself. The archives occupy multiple buildings and underground chambers, and materials are distributed across these spaces, not according to a single logical principle, but according to the accumulated decisions of successive archivists over multiple centuries. Some documents are stored in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano proper, in the climate-controlled underground bunkers built in the 1980s. Others are held in the Torre dei Venti, the Tower of the Winds, a 16th century structure that once housed an astronomical observatory and now contains some of the oldest and most fragile materials in the collection. Still others are kept in the Sala di Consultazione's adjacent storage rooms, in armadi organized by fondo and series, but with gaps and irregularities that reflect the messy reality of how documents actually arrived at the archives over centuries of accumulation. And then there are the materials held in off-site locations, in buildings and facilities that aren't publicly identified, but that Vatican officials acknowledge exist, used for materials that require special environmental controls, or that are too sensitive for regular archive storage, or that the Church has determined should remain physically separate from the main collection for reasons that aren't explained. This distributed storage creates a situation where even archive staff don't necessarily have comprehensive knowledge of what exists where. A curator working with the medieval collection might have no detailed knowledge of 20th century diplomatic files, and vice versa. And it means that the question, what does the Vatican archive contain, has no simple answer, because no single person or office maintains a complete current inventory of the entire collection. The official line is that comprehensive catalogs exist, but that they're internal documents not available to researchers, and that the published finding aids provide sufficient guidance for scholarly work. But researchers who've spent years working in the archives tell a different story. They describe discovering documents by accident, through references in other materials, through conversations with archive staff who happen to remember seeing something relevant years ago, through sheer persistence in requesting adjacent materials in hopes that something useful will turn up. This isn't how a fully cataloged, professionally managed archive should function. It's how a partially organized collection operates, where finding material depends as much on luck, connections, and institutional favor as it does on systematic research methodology. The consequences of this become most visible when you try to research specific events or decisions where documentation should exist, but proves impossible to locate through conventional catalog searches. Take, for instance, the Vatican's financial relationship with Banco Ambrosiano in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a scandal that involved allegations of money laundering, links to organized crime, and the mysterious death of banker Roberto Calvi, found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. The Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, was deeply implicated in the affair. It held shares in Ambrosiano. It had financial relationships with shell companies Calvi used for legal operations. And when Ambrosiano collapsed, the Vatican Bank faced serious scrutiny about what it knew and when it knew it. Documents related to these transactions must exist. Banks don't operate without paperwork, and the Vatican Bank's internal records from this period would provide crucial evidence about the extent of Vatican involvement and knowledge. But when researchers have attempted to access these materials, they've encountered a wall of bureaucratic restriction. The Vatican Bank maintains its own archive separate from the main Vatican archives, and that archive is not open to scholarly research. Materials held there are considered internal institutional records, not historical documents. And the discretionary rule applies with even greater force because the bank is a functioning financial institution with ongoing operations and client relationships that it argues must remain confidential. The Vatican's position is that banking records require privacy protections that historical documents don't, and that opening the bank's archives to researchers would violate fiduciary duties and potentially expose the institution to legal liability. But this position effectively places an entire category of material, financial records that could illuminate crucial questions about Vatican decision-making, institutional ethics, and connections to political and criminal networks, permanently beyond historical scrutiny. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this distinction between historical and operational records is legitimate, but the effect is the same. Whole categories of questions about Vatican finances, about how the Church's enormous global wealth is managed, about where money comes from and where it goes, remain unanswerable because the documentation exists but is classified under rules even more restrictive than those governing the main archives. This pattern extends to other Vatican institutions that maintain their own separate archives. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as mentioned earlier, but also the Secretariat of State, the Congregation for Bishops, the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, and numerous smaller offices and tribunals that generate records as part of their work, but that don't automatically transfer those records to the central archives. Each of these offices operates under its own access protocols, and in many cases, those protocols allow for no external research access at all. The result is an archipelago of archives scattered across different Vatican offices and different physical locations, each with its own classification system, its own discretionary access rules, and its own level of openness or restriction, and no central oversight or standardization that would allow researchers to navigate this fragmented landscape systematically. The discretionary rule that overrides all others operates not just at the level of individual document access, but at the level of entire institutional archives, where the Vatican determines which collections are historical and therefore potentially accessible, and which remain operational and therefore permanently closed. And because the Vatican is simultaneously a religious authority, a sovereign state, a diplomatic entity, and a global institutional network, the operational category can stretch to cover almost anything the Church considers sensitive, creating a situation where the boundaries between historical record and contemporary operation remain permanently flexible, permanently subject to institutional discretion, and permanently beyond external challenge or review. You've reached the point where the system reveals its ultimate logic, the place where all the procedures and classifications and discretionary powers converge into a single overriding principle that shapes not just what you can see, but what you can think, what questions you can meaningfully ask, and what kinds of historical understanding remain possible when access to evidence is controlled by the institution being studied. And this is where we confront the most troubling aspect of the Vatican archival system, which isn't the restrictions themselves, but the fact that restrictions shape research agendas in ways that become invisible over time, creating a scholarly literature that reflects institutional priorities rather than purely historical inquiry. Because when access depends on institutional approval, when certain topics consistently prove more difficult to research than others, when whole categories of questions lead to dead ends and denials while other questions receive smooth, cooperative assistance, historians begin, consciously or unconsciously, to orient their work toward projects the archives will support, and this process of self-selection means that the most important function of the discretionary rule isn't what it blocks, but what it shapes. The slow, subtle pressure it exerts on the entire field of Vatican studies, encouraging some lines of inquiry while discouraging others, not through formal censorship, but through the practical realities of what kinds of research are actually feasible under current access conditions. This isn't speculation, it's visible in the pattern of published scholarship. If you survey major academic works on Vatican history published over the past 30 years, you'll notice certain topics appear repeatedly. Papal diplomacy with established nation-states, theological development and doctrinal continuity, the institutional structure of the Church, biographical studies of popes and cardinals whose papers have been opened. These are all legitimate and important topics, but you'll also notice significant gaps, relatively little work on Vatican finances beyond the major scandals that became too public to ignore, limited research on internal disciplinary procedures, and how the Church handles accusations of clerical misconduct, sparse documentation of the Vatican's intelligence networks and information-gathering operations, and very few studies that examine the Church's institutional decision-making processes in areas where those decisions remain controversial or reflect poorly on Vatican leadership. These gaps aren't random. They correspond directly to areas where archival access is most restricted, where the discretionary rule operates most forcefully, and where researchers have learned through experience that pursuing certain questions will lead to frustration, denial, and ultimately abandoned projects. The result is a kind of archival selection pressure, where the scholarly literature evolves to fit the shape of what the archives make accessible rather than the shape of what historians consider most important to understand. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this constitutes a significant distortion or simply reflects the normal limitations of historical research. But the Vatican's unique position as both archive holder and historical subject creates a situation where the institution controls not just its own records, but, to a significant degree, the narrative that emerges from those records. This becomes most visible when you compare Vatican studies to scholarship on other major institutions with complex archival legacies. When historians research the Soviet Union, they work with archives that were opened suddenly and chaotically after 1991, creating a flood of previously inaccessible material that forced major revisions to existing historical understanding. Suddenly, it became possible to test Cold War narratives against internal Soviet documentation, to see what Moscow knew and when, to track decision-making processes that had been invisible or accessible only through defector testimony and intelligence estimates. The opening was messy and incomplete. Many Russian archives remain restricted, especially those dealing with intelligence operations and ongoing security concerns. but the sheer volume of newly available material transformed the field. Similarly, when historians research the Third Reich, they work with archives that were captured by occupying powers, dispersed across multiple countries, and eventually made accessible under legal frameworks that prioritize transparency and historical accountability over institutional protection. The result is a documentary record that's remarkably complete by the standards of 20th century authoritarian regimes, complete enough that major historical debates about Nazi Germany focus not on what documents exist, but on how to interpret the documents we have. The Vatican presents an entirely different situation. The institution survived, maintained control of its own records, and continues to operate as a sovereign entity with the legal authority to determine access conditions according to its own institutional interests. This creates a research environment where the subject of study controls the evidence, and where that control is exercised through a discretionary rule that requires no justification, permits no appeal, and operates according to criteria that aren't publicly disclosed. The long-term effect is a historical literature that's sophisticated, detailed, and in many ways impressive, but that also contains systematic blind spots corresponding to areas of institutional sensitivity, blind spots that become self-perpetuating, as each generation of scholars learns from their predecessors which questions are productive to pursue and which are likely to lead nowhere. The physical reality of this in the archives is subtle but unmistakable. Researchers who've worked there for extended periods describe an atmosphere of careful self-monitoring, where you learn not to push too hard on sensitive requests, not to frame your research in ways that might trigger institutional concern, not to appear too interested in the wrong kinds of questions. This isn't enforced through explicit warnings or threats. The archive staff are generally professional and courteous, and the prefect's office doesn't send around memos listing forbidden topics, but it operates through a system of signals and responses that researchers learn to read. The slight hesitation before a request is approved, the longer than expected delay in document delivery, the carefully neutral expression on an archivist's face when you inquire about access to a particular series. These aren't individual acts of censorship. They're the ambient conditions of working in an archive, where access is a privilege granted at institutional discretion, and where that discretion operates according to principles that prioritize institutional protection over comprehensive documentation. The consequences of this extend beyond academic scholarship into public understanding of church history and institutional behavior. When major controversies emerge about clerical sexual abuse, about Vatican finances, about diplomatic decisions during periods of genocide or authoritarian repression, the historical context necessary for understanding those controversies often remains inaccessible because it's locked in archives governed by the discretionary rule. The Church can claim that accusations are historically inaccurate or taken out of context, and historians have limited ability to verify or challenge those claims because the evidence necessary for verification remains under Vatican control. This doesn't mean the Church's defenses are necessarily false. In many cases, they may be entirely accurate, but it means that historical debates about Vatican behavior occur on uneven ground, where one side controls access to the primary evidence, and the other side must work with fragments, leaked documents, secondhand accounts, and inference. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this imbalance is sustainable in an era of increased demands for institutional transparency and accountability, but the Vatican has shown little inclination to fundamentally alter the system. The 2020 opening of the Pio Thuisine archives was presented as a breakthrough, and it was, but it was also a controlled release, managed according to Vatican priorities and timetables, and it left the basic discretionary structure entirely intact. The rule that overrides all others remains operative, remains unchallengeable, and remains the fundamental organizing principle of the entire archival system, not because the Vatican is uniquely secretive or unusually hostile to transparency, but because the institution has the sovereign authority to operate this way and has determined determined that maintaining discretionary control over its own historical record serves its institutional interest better than any alternative approach would. And until that calculation changes, until the costs of restricted access begin to outweigh the benefits of institutional control, the system will continue as it has for more than a century, granting access selectively, strategically, and always according to principles that place the Church's institutional needs above the historian's need for comprehensive documentation. You've traveled as deep into this as anyone can without actually entering those corridors yourself, without sitting in the sala di studio and feeling the weight of centuries pressing down through vaulted ceilings, without submitting request slips and waiting to see what comes back and what doesn't, without living inside the daily reality of a system where every answer depends on a question you can't directly ask. What has been decided about my access before I even arrived? Because that's the ultimate truth of the Vatican archives. The discretionary rule that overrides all others operates most powerfully not in the moments when it denies access, not in the formal restrictions and closed fondos, but in the silence before the question is even posed, in the research projects that never get started because historians have learned which topics lead to brick walls, in the dissertations that get redirected towards safer ground, in the books that never get written because the evidence necessary to write them remains permanently out of reach. This is the deepest level of institutional control, not censorship that you can identify and challenge, but a structural condition that shapes what counts as askable, researchable, knowable. And the Vatican has perfected this system over centuries, not through conspiracy or malice, but through the simple exercise of sovereign authority over its own institutional memory. The physical reality you'd encounter if you walked into the archive today is remarkably ordinary. A modern facility, professional staff, clean, well-lit research rooms, careful handling of fragile materials, all the surface features of a contemporary academic archive. But underneath that surface operates a system of access control more absolute than anything you'd find in national archives bound by freedom of information laws, more discretionary than university archives governed by professional archival standards, more opaque than corporate archives that at least must answer to shareholders and auditors. The Vatican answers to itself, to the Pope and the offices of the Roman Curia, and the discretionary rule exists because the institution determined long ago that maintaining unreviewable control over its documentary record was essential to protecting its spiritual authority, its diplomatic relationships, and its ability to manage how its own history gets told. Whether you find this acceptable or troubling depends on where you stand on fundamental questions about institutional transparency, historical accountability, and whether religious organizations should be held to the same documentary standards as secular governments. And those questions don't have easy answers, which is perhaps why the system has survived as long as it has, operating in the ambiguous space between legitimate institutional privacy and problematic historical censorship. The scholars working in those archives today, the ones who've gained access and learned to navigate the restrictions, have produced remarkable work. Detailed studies of papal diplomacy, careful analyses of doctrinal development, biographical reconstructions that illuminate how the Church's central leadership operated during crucial historical moments. This work is real, valuable, and has genuinely advanced historical understanding. But every book, every article, every conference paper carries an invisible asterisk, a silent acknowledgement that what you're reading is what the archives permitted the historian to discover, and that other discoveries, other interpretations, other understandings remain on the other side of the discretionary rule, accessible only to Vatican officials with the authority to look, or perhaps not accessible at all, simply waiting in sealed armadi for a future moment when the institution determines that the political, theological, and diplomatic costs of disclosure have finally fallen below acceptable thresholds. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this waiting game serves anyone's interests, whether it protects the Church or undermines its credibility, whether it preserves institutional dignity or simply delays inevitable reckonings with difficult historical truths. But these debates occur in academic journals and conference panels, far from the public consciousness. And the Vatican continues to operate as it always has, opening materials when it chooses, restricting what it considers sensitive, and maintaining absolute discretion over the boundary between what can be known and what must remain hidden. The rule that overrides all others isn't written on a plaque above the archive entrance. It isn't published in the researcher's handbook. It isn't something any Vatican official would explicitly defend in public debate. But it's there, encoded in every access protocol, embedded in every document request form, operative in every decision about what gets cataloged, what gets opened, what gets indefinitely deferred. The principle that the institution's need for control supersedes the historian's need for evidence. That sovereign authority over records trumps scholarly demands for transparency, and that the Church's institutional interests provide sufficient justification for restrictions that require no other explanation and permit no external appeal. You can agree with this principle or reject it, but you can't ignore it, because it shapes everything that follows. Every book you read about Vatican history, every documentary you watch about papal decisions, every debate about what the Church knew and when it knew it, all of it occurs in the shadow of the discretionary rule. All of it reflects not just historical reality, but the filtered version of historical reality that the archives made available. And until that structure changes, until discretion gives way to codified standards, and indefinite closure gives way to mandatory review timelines, the Vatican archives will remain fundamentally different from every other major historical repository. Not because of what they contain, but because of the principle that governs who gets to see it and under what conditions. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. At the edge of that realization, at the boundary between what we can know and what remains on the other side of a rule that operates without exception, without appeal, without anything except the institutional authority that created it and maintains it. I hope this gave you something to think about, something more than mystery and atmosphere, actual systems, actual structures, the real architecture of how silence gets built and maintained. If this resonated with you, if it felt like time well spent in the quiet hours, maybe consider leaving a like on the video. Maybe subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. We share stories like this every day, digging into the mechanisms behind Vatican secrets, the physical and procedural reality underneath the legends. And wherever you are, whatever time it is where you're listening, I hope you rest well, and I hope when you think about history now, you remember that what we know is always shaped by what someone decided we were allowed to know. Until tomorrow night.